Okay, welcome. I was told we better get started. Let me begin by with just a brief introduction here of our three panelists that we are so happy to have with us today at the University of Michigan School of Law. So on the end, we have Jenny Egan, who is a juvenile public defender in Baltimore. She focuses on school-based arrests and ending the school-to-prison pipeline and has written on these topics. Jenny was a fellow at the National Women's Law Center and the advocacy coordinator for the ACLU's National Security Project. She's also a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, and we're happy to welcome her back to her alma mater. See that? There we go. Wonderful. And next we have DeRay McKeeson. DeRay is a civil rights activist working on innovation, equity, and justice. As a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and co-founder of JoinCampaignZero.org, MappingPoliceViolence.org, and OurStates.org. DeRay has worked to connect individuals with knowledge and tools and to provide citizens and policymakers with common sense policies to ensure equity. Spurred by the death of Michael Brown and the subsequent protests in Ferguson and beyond, DeRay has been at the forefront of activism to undo the systems and structures that led to mass incarceration and police killings of black and other minority populations. He hosts the critically acclaimed podcast, Save the People, which creates space for conversation about the most important issues of the week and ensures that people have the information they need to be thoughtful activists and organizers. And we are happy to welcome DeRay to the University of Michigan. And last but not least, we have Damar Pittman, who is the founder of Discriminology, a nonprofit focused on increasing parent, educator, and community understanding of educational equity issues. Damar is an educator, activist, and self-taught technologist who believes strongly in the power of technology to shrink long-standing equity and achievement gaps. As a restorative justice coordinator and an advocate for culturally responsive pedagogy, Damar works to remove the barriers that directly and indirectly deny black and brown children access to high-quality education. His current research focuses on the disproportionate and biased allocation of resources to students of color and on leveraging technology to help address this problem. And we're happy to welcome Damar to the University of Michigan. So we'll get started. All of us are still processing the tragic news out of Florida with another shooting. Well, you see what's on my mind. Another shooting had nothing to do with the police, but had everything to do with powerful assault weapons that we still have on our streets and sadly in some of our schools. And obviously this is a fraught political topic. People are wondering whether this will give us an occasion to talk about gun control. But some of us are worried perhaps that this will give some people reason to talk about tougher policing, more police presence in schools, maybe more guns even in schools, but put them in the hands of the police and put them in the schools. And our panelists know very well where this kind of thing will take us. Activists and scholars have focused the nation's attention on the problems of police brutality against unarmed people of color and on what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, the system of mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts blacks in America. We are all familiar with the troubling statistics that show how black and brown citizens are more likely to be stopped and frisked, arrested and jailed, and giving longer sentences than whites for comparable offenses. But we also need to focus on how some of our nation's most vulnerable citizens, black and brown children in our K through 12 schools, are being policed and punished within schools and set up for failure. This is an urgent social justice matter. I'd like to start our discussion with the following question for each of our panelists. Can each of you say something about why this issue should be of greater public concern and say something about the kind of activism and policy we need to address it. Also, please share with us some firsthand knowledge about these troubling school practices and the people affected by them. Who wants to start?
So I'll go ahead and start. Again, my name is DeMar Pittman. I want to thank the University of Michigan for inviting me here. So to answer that question, I guess I'll start with my own experience as a black man who was, once a student and then became an educator. My perspective of the situation in the school system is one of being able to see both sides of it. So for the last about 5 years, I was a restorative justice coordinator or behavior specialist in Title I schools. Just to give you some background, my journey with discriminology started about a year and a half ago when I was at an elementary school and I was in the role of a restorative justice coordinator. And I had 2 African-American female students brought to my office by a teacher's aide. The teacher's aide requested that I look into these 2 students' behavior, and the teacher wanted them to be suspended for causing disturbance in the classroom. The 2 girls were incredibly upset. They were crying, emotionally disturbed at the time. So when the teacher's aide left, I talked to the 2 girls, tried to calm them down, tried to figure out what was going on, and they told me that their teacher told them in front of their classmates that their future children would end up in prison and have attitudes just like them. And these were the only 2 black girls, the only 2 black students in the class. So when they told me that, I'm like, okay, wow, this is crazy. Let me go make sure this is accurate. So when I went to the classroom and talked to the teacher, middle-aged white woman, she said that I said it. She didn't deny it. She told me that it was her classroom and she could say what she wanted. And I was like, okay, wow. Well, the 2 students were really upset. They were crying. And I was like, well, can you at least apologize to them and talk to them about your comment, because that's racially insensitive, among other things. And she said she wouldn't apologize, but she would talk to them. So then I saw that I wasn't getting anywhere with her, so I went and reported the situation to administration, and they seemed upset by it. But then 2 weeks later, I got fired, and the principal told me that she was getting pressure from the teachers union, from her boss, that I was asking too many questions. And she was getting ready to retire. This is a principal who had been in this district for maybe 20 years. And she told me when I first came in to keep my head down. And I told her that I couldn't. You brought me in here to help the culture of the school be more equitable, and that's what I was doing. So, it was that incident that caused me to look deeper into the issues of disproportionality and equity in school. And that's what, ultimately led me to creating discriminology. So to answer the question, I think that a lot of times educators and people who are involved in these policy decisions forget that learning is inherently cultural, and that the institutions that are responsible for educating our students, they're not culturally neutral. So you have to create an environment, I think, that is inclusive of all cultures, and that teaches teaches students where they're at, and that to borrow some terms from ecological systems theory, that the school environment has to be ecologically fit to the student and the community. And I think we get in trouble a lot of times because we don't do, as educators and school leaders, we don't do the initial background, and we don't do the initial, I guess, training of our teachers to be able to serve students of varying backgrounds. So I think if we do a better job at, meeting students where they're at, I think that can do a lot to, solve a lot of the issues that are currently taking place.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be here. It's good to talk to the law community, and always great to talk to researchers. I'm DeRay. I am a protester and activist. It is great to see a fellow person from Ferguson here who was out there in the hardest days. Tom, so I'll start by saying, I used to be a sixth grade math teacher. I taught math in East New York, Brooklyn. It was incredible. I taught in Starrett City, the single largest project community in the country. We were about 40, 20-story buildings. It's so big that we had our own zip code, so it's a huge sort of part of like the far east Brooklyn. And then I worked at the Harlem Children's Zone. I helped lead the largest community center in the Harlem Children's Zone. We had about 500 kids a day, about 1,400 families a cycle, one of the biggest after-school centers in the country. You mostly know the zone probably because of the schools, but it's 14 sites across 90 blocks. I went back home, opened up an after-school center on the west side of Baltimore. Then I trained and supported a third of all the new teachers in the city of Baltimore for 2 cycles and became the #2 human capital there. Left, was a leader in human capital in Minneapolis. Mike Brown got killed. I quit. Was a national organizer for a year or so, and then most recently was a chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore for a year. I just left in August. And my bias is always about sort of systems and structures, and I think one of the things I worry about when I'm around researchers or people who study education is that we figured out how to make like a great classroom, and we figured out how to make sort of a great school. We've not figured out how to make a system of either. And most of the research and things that inform us at the highest levels in school districts are really about like the singular, they're like about a school or about a classroom. They are rarely about a system. And I think about, so school police is a great example, that like most of the anecdotes and most of the people write about like a bad incident or like a bad thing that happened. And, at my level as a chief of human capital, I was making a decision that would impact 80,000 kids every time. So I couldn't sort of make something based on this one thing. Or I had 200 schools. In Baltimore, the school system is 11,000 employees, as many people as the city of Baltimore itself, a $1.3 billion budget, just a little bit less than the city, like the city government budget. So we were a huge footprint. That's a couple things. One, in the city of Baltimore, we struggle with what did it mean to have a tough city. Like last year is the first year in recorded history where more people got killed in the city of Baltimore than New York City. So it's a tough place. We had a school where 6 kids got killed on the way to or from a school last year. We had another school where a kid killed another kid in the classroom. He later got acquitted, and we didn't talk about this, but he later, she's from Baltimore. He later got acquitted, but he just got killed. Did you see that he got killed, which is like, so and at the district, we were always trying to figure out like, how do we keep kids safe in a city that like is just struggling, right? Like with trauma. So we thought there about like, what did it mean to have police officers in schools that were moved from discipline, but just sort of like helped around making sure people didn't come into our schools. And there were some things that happened that we never publicly talked about, but last year when I was at Chief of Human Capital, we had a van pull up to a school. A woman gets out, she walks into the front office, and she like talks to the front office, distracts them. 6 people get out of the van and walk up to a classroom and beat one of our kids up. And like, it happened on like a weird day, so the news just didn't pick it up, but we knew, and we knew really well. And it was one of those things that we were just like how do we protect our kids in the building? We weren't worried about like school police interacting with our kids anymore. We were sort of like, they're gonna be fine. They knew that they would probably get fired immediately at the district level if that happened, even if we structurally couldn't do it with the police union contract. But we had all these incidents of like things happening to kids, like with people just like walking into the buildings, and like we struggled a lot with that. Like that was actually more of our struggle than like the discipline conversation with kids. And though I'm an activist and a protester, like I too struggle, because it was like I'd sit in these meetings and I'm like, I don't know what to do when a van pulls up to a school, and like our teachers and principals aren't equipped to do anything about that. And like I'm not convinced we need to have police in general, but in those moments, like we struggle with like what the what actually looked like. And again, we were always focused on like, what do we do with a system of schools? And in Baltimore, we have 200 schools, and we probably have we have less than 100 school police officers. It just there weren't a lot of them. And they were special police, so they had the same power as the police from the city, and they patrolled and did those sort of things. The other thing is that in Minneapolis, I was in charge of all hiring for all staff, and in Baltimore, I was the only person that could hire and fire people. And what was interesting there is that we got a DOJ, or we got a civil rights office finding that we were disproportionately suspending kids of color in kindergarten. And so they're 5 years old, 6 years old, and we're suspending a ton of black kids. And in Minneapolis, it was interesting because Minneapolis has the highest performing white students in the state of Minnesota and the lowest performing students of any race, non-white, in the state of Minnesota. So the achievement gap is sort of a wild thing in Minneapolis, even though it's a relatively wealthy place. And what you found was that our teachers just didn't actually know anything about behavior management. So when we can't suspend them anymore, we're in these meetings trying to figure out what to do, and it's all really theoretical. So we're we should have polar bucks in classrooms, or little things, and people are like, well, we don't want to have capitalism. And you're like, the kids aren't sitting down, right? So if you need to print a little thing that looks like a dollar bill and put a polar bear on it, then let's try that. But Minneapolis was fascinating because people were just engrossed with these philosophical battles. And I went to this one school, and it was a majority black school, and people had told me it was the kids were it was a tough school, and I'm ready, because when I was a teacher, I had to cover for a class once. I walk in, the substitute leaves, and I walk in, and they put all the chairs on the desk, and they're in a relay race. So I'm ready for, I'm ready for a tough school, and I walk in, and these kids are the most chill kids I've ever seen in my entire life. They just aren't listening to this teacher. It might as well not be in the room, but that was his fault. It wasn't their fault. And I'm always reminded that classrooms are the first place that we teach people about power. That outside of the home, classrooms are the first place that kids learn what power looks like. What does it mean to be in community with somebody and disagree or agree, and what does it mean to have ownership over your body or not ownership? And those conversations I'm fascinated by. And Minneapolis was incredible because what you saw were people who just theoretically got it. But structurally at the classroom and the root level, everybody wanted to talk about restorative justice, but I was concerned that people didn't know what, a model of restorative justice requires community and kids sitting in a circle and talking. And if you can't get them to sit down, then there's no restorative justice. That's an impossible model to implement. And we went from no behavior management to restorative justice. And as you can imagine, that didn't work out. And then they had to redouble it. So I'm always fascinated with how do we do it at the structural level that'll impact more than one building? We figured out the building solution. We've not figured out a system of buildings.
So I'll just talk about my experience in Baltimore City as a juvenile public defender, and specifically with the school police, because I have a problem with the school police and those issues, while still facing lots of the community challenges and safety challenges that are happening in and around Baltimore City schools. But part of what I think is important, and I want to draw from Aaron on the last panels, is the history of school police and policing of children of color in Baltimore. Because in the United States, education, literacy, and the right to that education has it's one of our only positive rights, right? So many states have the right to an education built into their state constitutions. It's something universal, free public education is one of the only positive rights we have in this country. And two, it's long been the site of repression of people of color, from literacy laws that made it illegal for slaves to read or have access to education, to school segregation that for generations post-slavery kept people of color from accessing quality educations, to the resegregation of our schools that has happened since the brief period where we attempted to desegregate for 5 to 8 years. So all of those things and those sites and struggles have been and are a part of the legacy of slavery and segregation. That's true in Baltimore City as well. In Baltimore, as you know, Thurgood Marshall, who argued Brown v. Board and then was on the Supreme Court, came up as a civil rights lawyer in Baltimore. After Brown v. Board, Baltimore, like everywhere else, did not desegregate immediately. So they start to desegregate schools very slowly in the 1960s. And as that's happening, in 67 and 68, students began to engage in civil disobedience and protest, which is when the Baltimore City School Security Force was founded, 1968. They were a host of police officers who were too rogue and bad for Baltimore police. So, as you can imagine, that's a pretty rough thing in '68. The Baltimore school security was founded on, in order to fight desegregation and in order to criminalize children in Baltimore. That's paired with a juvenile justice system. And I'm sorry, I always have to do this history stuff, so I'll talk really quick. Just go like this if I'm going too fast. A juvenile justice system in Baltimore that is born directly out of slavery. Illinois and Cook County takes a lot of credit for their 1898 first juvenile justice, but Baltimore founded a house of refuge for children of color. Of course, that's not the language they used, in 1868. What else happened in 1868? The end of slavery. So there was a rush to Baltimore of free young black youth who had been separated from their families by the violence of slavery, and in order to put those people back to work, Maryland, and Baltimore specifically, invented the idea of a juvenile delinquent. So those freed slaves who were under 18 were declared delinquent because they didn't have homes, because they didn't have families, because America had ripped them from them and sent them to work in youth camps in the far west, and basically just sent them back to the plantations that they had just escaped, all across western Maryland and the eastern shore. So when we have this school security force created to resegregate our schools and to fight the civil disobedience that's happening, they then interact with a juvenile justice system that is running something to this day that is called the youth camps. It is clear that both systems are working together in order to further an agenda of white supremacy. And that is also comes into play with a city who has just been robbed of resources, who has been bled dry by the counties and by a structure that allows people to come and work and take all of the capital of Baltimore and remove it and take it back to its mostly white suburbs. And that is a very difficult environment to work in. I'll just tell some of the stories that I've seen. One school-based arrest, sorry, Mo had something to say about that. One school-based arrest I had, it went viral. It was a video of a teacher who takes off her shoes in order to start hitting a young woman. And the teacher got in trouble, but then everyone was like, well, that young woman was freaking out and she threw a book and da-da-da-da-da, everyone's at fault, everyone's at fault. And the way that the system failed both the teacher and that student. So that student was my client, and I have permission to tell this story in an anonymous way, just for your MPRE ethical questions. My student was, or my client was 16 years old. Just the light of her family. She had all A's going through. She knew she wanted to go to the University of Maryland. She knew she was going to get a ride. She was doing everything right, and everything was perfect, and she got pregnant. And she got pregnant, and she felt like she had let everyone down. And she didn't tell anyone for a long time, and then she had that baby, and she was a senior in high school. She was she had the baby during testing in the fall, so she missed some critical testing in the fall. She had the baby. Mom said, I'm going to take care, I'll be your child care for your last semester, you're just going to finish. So she has some testing. It's not the park. What was before the park? Yeah, it was the HSA test. So she had missed the HSA, and there's only one makeup HSA day for her. And she goes to the classroom where they're supposed to take the test, and the proctor, who doesn't work in the school, who's just there for the day, says, no, you're in the wrong room, you gotta go here. She goes to that HSA, she sits down, they start the test, she realizes it's the wrong test. The proctor there says, you have to go back to the other room. She goes back to the other room where the proctor saw her the first time, and the proctor's like, oh, I was wrong, here's the test, and she is now starting the test 25 minutes late. She has to pass this class in order to graduate. She's losing her childcare. This is everything for her. The proctor says, put your pencils down, and she keeps going for a minute. And the proctor says, put your pencils down, and she's trying to finish, and the proctor says, I've invalidated your test. And at the computer says she's invalidated her test. Now, all that happens before cell phones come out, right? And the girl flips out. All the stress of her life, all the stress of everything builds up, and she throws a chair. And the teacher and her, and they escalate, and eventually the teacher throws the first blow. But in the end, my client got charged with assault, the teacher got charged with assault, and the teacher lost her job, and my client didn't graduate high school on time. And both of them, within 2 hours, could have come together and said sorry and fixed it. But the problem is there were police there. And the police didn't want everyone to explain what happened. They didn't want everyone to get their sides of the story. They wanted to write their reports, cuff everybody, and cart them off, and that's what happened. Now, my client feels horrible that that teacher was fired. I mean, when I tell you, like, just the nerdiest nerd in the world who lost her temper, she's like, I would have hit me too. I threw a chair. Like, it was inappropriate. And no one felt like the teacher should lose her job, but of course she did. And I don't think the teacher wanted my client if she would have known what had happened or the stress that led up to that day. I don't think that would have happened. But Baltimore has police, and it has less than 100 police, mostly because we started bringing, as public defenders, to light the ways in which they were charging children as young as 8 with crimes, children as young as 9 with malicious destruction for writing on their desks, charging every school fight, bringing every kid to court. And we started to show that Baltimore City Public Schools was not keeping accurate records. They're federally required to report how many arrests they have. They were not reporting that accurately. In the 2011 civil rights data collection, Philadelphia and Baltimore both reported that they had had 0 school-based arrests, which is hilarious. And it's because before Obama, the CRC had no real teeth and people weren't doing, but there's no mechanism for gathering that data. Even as it's required by the state legislature today, I know that Baltimore City Schools is reporting erroneous and just blatantly false data. And I know that because I can track how many school-based cases I get. I know how many arrests I've seen, and all I had to do, just as a lawyer with no resources, as a public defender, all I had to do was just have my secretary keep a list of every school-based arrest, right? So that when the schools tout their improvement, I can go and say, well, I have the names. You say you had 500 arrests last year. I have the names of 2,000 kids. And those are the sort of things you're going to have to do as an advocate, is to find ways to push back against systems that are designed to hide the ways in which they are working against kids. So that's just a story, but I will say the solution for me is that there should be no police in schools. What happens in schools and behavior that happens in schools, if it rises to the level of arrest, or that, for a young man who was stabbed in school, well, school police aren't taking care of that anyway. School police didn't do that investigation. School police don't come and testify. They're not homicide. If it rises to the level of it needing to be criminalized, school police are not the people to do it. And I think it's very dangerous. The school police have gone on this, we're holistic, the NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers. They want to use fake nomenclature so they're not police. These are police. That school resource officers say they're 3 things. They're mentors, they're police officers, and they're teachers, because they can teach classes. They're not qualified or trained to teach classes. They're not qualified or trained to be mentors or social workers. And as police, they have obligations that conflict with restorative practices, that conflict with mentoring, and that conflict with teaching. So police officers are not appropriate for any school, and they shouldn't be there.
Wonderful. I hope you guys are taking notes and setting up your questions. And I promise we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So I just want one brief follow-up for this issue, and then I'll raise another, and then maybe we'll open the floor a bit early, because I know you all have lots of questions, interesting ones, I'm sure. All of you mentioned restorative justice, and so I think it'd be nice to give us some context for thinking about why that's important in dealing with some of the issues that you put on the table, and what that kind of looks like on the ground, and what obstacles you find in your work to realizing that. DeRay mentioned just getting people to sort of sit down is one issue, and to talk to each other if restorative practices are about communication in some important way. So that's one kind of follow-up. The other follow-up has to do with something that we encounter in contexts where we need information to make an assessment about whether our rights are being respected, upheld. And one thing that we all know is that, particularly when it comes to information about school discipline practices, this is very hard to come by. District schools kind of keep that information, as you were just suggesting, Jenny, very close to the chest, so to speak. How do we deal with the information deficit and the things in place that make this a challenge? in related context, when we think about audit studies of employment practices, housing practices, we see similar worries. And we're going to see similar worries as people continue to explore the way in which, this is going to be part of our next question, discrimination plays out on the internet, and how you have to kind of violate terms of use for internet providers often to get the information they need to see if discrimination is taking place in some of the practices. So I'm curious to know what you guys think about that particular challenge, getting the information to help make the case for the injustices and then to be able to take the next step. So there's that, and then there's restorative practices. Give us a little context for that.
I think for discriminology, we see education as a vehicle that shapes identity, and school environments shape identity. And like you said, DeRay, when students are in the classroom, they're learning. They're learning from their interactions with their peers. They're learning from their interactions with their teachers. So I think if we approach education from this idea that, especially at like K through 8th, this is a critical moment in those child's lives for identity development. They're learning the norms and cultures, or the norms of society, through their interactions with their peers and stuff. So I think that, if we can move away from this test-centric model that, started with the No Child Left Behind Act, and these other type of, the marketizing of the education system, and think more deeply about, the relationships that are being built or not being built in the schoolhouse, I think that'll do a lot to improve outcomes. And I mean, that's the idea behind restorative justice is, building empathy towards the people that you interact with, and just learning and understanding another person's perspective. So that starts with, this idea of building relationships in a school. What's the mission of the school? What's the vision of the school district? And if the school or the district doesn't have, equity built into their mission or their vision statement, if the school or the district doesn't talk about diversity or inclusion or relationship building at the level of, the mission or the vision statement, then I don't think that that's going to trickle down and create, school environments where that's going to be possible. And one of the ways that we're doing that at Discriminology is we're trying to change, the way you evaluate schools. So right now the main model of evaluation is how well do students do on tests. And that informs a lot of what goes on in the schoolhouse and in the classroom. But if we, change the mode of evaluation from, okay, is equity built into your mission or your vision statement? What do your policies look like? Do you have any equity or culturally based programs, specifically mentioned in your policy? What do your MTSS or the systems of support in the school, are they culturally informed? Do you have them at all, right? Do you use restorative justice? Do you use mindfulness programs? What are your training, procedures or PD look like for your teachers? So what we're doing, and like you said, there's an information gap. Right now, education data, exists in OCR, and it sort of exists in silos. Like you said, you can't get access to a lot of the information. So what we're doing in Discriminology is evaluating schools from the input level, which starts at, like funding and mission statements and policy, all the way to, how they impact the community. And one way we're doing that is by crowdsourcing information from parents and from communities. And also using various types of bots to scrape district and school level websites, so we can see what's actually in their mission statements, to see what's in their policy. So I think one of the main things is to change how we evaluate schools and move from a test-centric model to a more, holistic evaluation.
And the police, drive me nuts in a host of ways. It's the school thing, I just really struggle because I know my bias is around sort of the system and structure part. I will agree that I think that if we funded public education different, we would make different choices. And in Baltimore, when we think about the difference between equality and equity, equality is the idea that everybody gets the same thing. Equity is that people get what they need and deserve. And when we think about funding, it's all about equity. And in Baltimore, we were just making impossible choices. So we were choosing between do we fix the doors that some kids broke in the school, or do we fix the elevator? Or you probably saw with the heaters. We were in meetings being hope it doesn't get really cold, because we literally are going to take money from next year to fix the heaters this year, and we're stealing from the next year kids. And you think about things in the city of Baltimore, we're the single biggest users of taxis, the school system is. We taxi the majority of our homeless kids and our special need kids in single occupancy taxis. So we're always running a deficit because we just don't have money to do the work in a way that actually makes sense. And I struggle with what that looks like. And I will say, given the set of not great choices, we trust the school police more than we trust the city police, which was not necessarily that's not a huge honor, but it was true, especially because at least they were our employees. At least I could find out anything I needed about you. It was city police. It was please stay away from our buildings. Don't come near our kids. Don't call the city police. And we had to call them because, Jenny said, I remember we had a child pornography case that we managed when I was there, and our police can't investigate child pornography. So we did enough to prove that there was child pornography. Then we had to turn the computers over to the city. So there are a host of things that we had a kid, and I don't even know, we didn't really talk before the panel, but there's a kid who got sexually assaulted by a basketball coach in an office, and we found out right before Thanksgiving. And our police officers can't investigate child abuse, sexual assault. That's not, our police can't do it. So we had to essentially prove that we had proof that it was happening, and then we had to call the city. So there is sort of this complicated relationship that we have that makes a lot of us uncomfortable, because while we have more faith in our police officers because they were our employees than we had in the city police, there were a host of things that when they happened to our kids, we actually couldn't do anything about. So assault our police officers could do, but things that sort of went outside that realm, we sort of struggle with. I will say that in Baltimore, we had psych exams for all of our police officers, and I know because I got them. So when when police officers originally got hired, there'd be a psych exam, and it was hard because we couldn't send them, it was hard to send them back for another one if something went wrong, but we got one up front, which was better than most places, but still not ideal. And I don't know about that. I'd be interested to follow up about this information deficit, because we actually did have a lot of information, and if it was lies, then we need to figure that out. But it was sort of fascinating because as the chief of human capital, I had access to almost anything about an adult. So I could read your email, I could do anything that you did at the school system. And we were able to really hold people accountable. It was hard though, because we were coming on a legacy of that not happening. So the CEO now is Dr. Santelises, but before that, when I first became chief, the CEO before had put a moratorium on disciplining staff members. So my first day, I get there and there's no labor relations department, they've all been fired or quit. And nobody had been disciplined in 2 years. So I'm getting, it's a case of one teacher picked a special ed kid up by his foot and held him upside down. Then he did it the next year. And I'm why is he still an employee? And they're well, Dr. Thornton just said we couldn't discipline people. And you're well, this is a crazy, that's a crazy place. And we had teachers who got put on administrative leave, but they got put on administrative leave over the phone, so we had no record of them being on leave. So they're calling, being do I report to work? And I'm I thought you were at work. I don't, we had no record you weren't at work, So there was sort of this wild period of cleanup that led to this lapse in information, and I don't think we're at that point anymore. And I do think that we can live in a place where we don't have the police. So we try to do to get around the police, which is part of the reason why there's so few, is that we started to hire hall monitors, which was our title, but it really created space for principals to hire community members who could help out and just de-escalate without needing the intervention. What we found though became a challenge with the teacher's contract is that they were union members, and it became really hard to get rid of them. So what you'd find is that like somebody who was amazing 40 years ago, they're like still the hall monitor, you know? And like they don't know the kids anymore. They like, you know, like it just is like a hard place. And education, as you can imagine, is super touchy-feely. So you get these people who like, you love Mr. Johnson. He's 55 and like is the only hall monitor now, and you love him, so you don't want him to lose his job, but he like is not actually helping out in the school culture anymore. And it'd be this weird place where it's like we don't want to fire Mr. Johnson because we employ more sort of we employ so many like lower wage people in the city of Baltimore that if we just started firing people like that, that would be bad for the city. But he also isn't making a positive contribution to school culture like he was 20 years ago. And we're like, and we just didn't know, we were stuck, you know, in this place of like, a hall monitor costs about $100,000 as a position. It's just a lot of money, but like it's not making an impact, and we don't want to terminate you, the person, because like you're a good person, but it's also not having, like, and we were just stuck in the set of choices that like there was no easy answer for us to do something about, which didn't mean that we needed the police, but it did mean that we tried at the structural level to figure out how to move people and things around, and like it just wasn't as easy as we thought it would be, which was actually really hard. And I will say, I think now, and you know, I'd be interested to see how it'll play out in the next couple of years, but we've had really tough talks with the school police about like, if this, like we won't defend you if you go rogue, right? That like this will not be just like a defense of the police because you're our employees. And like as a protester who was a chief of human capital, like we had some moments where it was like, this just isn't okay, right? Like we got to figure this out. And I think what was most surprising was that it wasn't actually the school police that we fought with the most. It was like people in the buildings who were like, I remember when this kid got sexually assaulted and we had proof and like I had to fight to suspend the principal. And somebody said to me, like, the principal's a new principal. And I was like, the girl got, like, she's 11. Like, she got sexually assaulted in this room, and the principal, what happened was that there was a fight between two girls around Christmas, and they fought over who was his girlfriend. And we had some indication that the school staff knew that they knew the fight happened, and they knew what it was about. So we were just like, at the very least, I got to suspend you until there's an investigation, like at the very least. And like, I remember going to battle about that. Like, people are like, he's new. And I'm like, if that was your daughter and him being new would not be okay, like, that wouldn't be like an okay sort of rationale to say to somebody. But so I think it was actually more, the school police, it was like a culture of people sort of making excuses about things that was sort of beyond school police actually for us, that we had to work really hard to hold people accountable. And we had a viral incident with a teacher not being kind to our students in a really aggressive way. And we were able to move on those things in a way that actually made sense in the union, which we didn't always agree with. They were our partners in that sort of stuff, but the school culture thing still was like it just wasn't as easy at scale. We had some schools that did it really well, but trying to figure out in our hardest schools, like how do you actually set up behavior management, and like not that it needed the police, but like we didn't actually see great examples of that around the country that we could use either.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on that and move to that question about technology and it, because DeRay came in at a time of transition based on data that advocates collected and used to leverage against the police, the school police. So right before DeRay came on with a new CEO of schools, because the chief of police had been fired. Although the school system will still not say why technically, but I know, so that's fine. But they won't confirm it. So he's fired. He wasn't
fired, he was put on leave.
He's put on leave and then eventually resigned, which is the nice way of firing someone who has some really serious issues. But he was fired, the CEO of schools stepped down, 3 officers were charged with assault against students in various incidents, and that's because we collected the data, but also because as a public defender, I know my duty is not just to win the cases in court, because I won for years all my cases against school police, all of them, and I could have won them, and all the arrests kept coming in. It didn't stop anything. Police don't care if I win. The kid still got locked up, and he still dropped out, and it still ruined his life, right? Even if I get facts not sustained, who cares? So collecting that data was a part of being able to push back against false narratives, and collecting stories and connecting respondents who in adults would be defendants, respondents to advocates so that they could tell their own stories. So connecting with youth advocates in the city, working with Youth as Resources, working with Baltimore Algebra Project, and other people who could leverage those kids' stories is a part of it. But the data is really elusive. I have claims against BCPS up the wazoo, and all I want to do is sue them, right? I have them ready to go. I have plaintiffs ready to go. But no one will sue BCPS. One, because Baltimore's real buddy-buddy, and everyone who works at a litigation shop is funded by a person who used to be the CEO of school. So there's that issue. But the other issue is community lawyering. So where do you get the data? I judge lawyers I call I decide if they're a community lawyer or not based on one question. There was a group house, a group art house where everyone was kicked out. So the housing inspector and police came out and said, you can't live here, everyone kicked out. I got a call on my cell phone and I called every housing lawyer I know. And there's two kinds of lawyers. The kinds who said, what are their claims? Or what do you think the claims are gonna be? And the kind who said, what's the address? Right? So as law students, I need you to go out and I need you to be a lawyer that says, what's the address? I need you to go there and show up in your suit and act like you have too much authority in order to advocate for community members who are being disempowered, rather than having it be an intellectual exercise where you're like, well, that 1983 claim was denied in 92, and I want you to fight and push good law. I want you to create narratives. If you meet with people and if you go to where kids are, the data will come to you. So I have shops who wanted to sue for education discrimination or failure to provide free and adequate public education for young people, and I was like, I have all the clients, and the lawyer at this big firm kept saying, just give him this letter and my card, have him call me. My client is an 11-year-old homeless special education student. You think he's gonna call you or come to your offices downtown for a meeting? I need you to sit outside of New Hope Academy. Don't tell them, just kidding. I need you to sit outside of New Hope Academy and ask every kid whether or not they were kept inside the padded room that day. That's how you find a plaintiff, that's how you find data. And so I just say, be a community lawyer, show up, live in the communities where you work, be present in the schools where you work. Don't live in the nice Tony suburbs and drive in and pretend you're gonna advocate for kids in West Baltimore. Like, I live 2 blocks from my clients. I know what's happening at the school because that's where my kids will go. Hummo, she's a Barclay Bulldog. So that's part of it, and then take data serious. Lawyers think they can do everything. You need to be trained in statistics. You need to be trained in methods. You need to know what the science is behind data collection so that you can challenge it and use it effectively in court. You don't know everything because you have a JD, methodology, and science matter.
The only thing I'll piggyback on that is that there's also like a room for, I sat in a lot of rooms where people, like, their hearts are in the right place, they just didn't know. And like, I would have loved to have this conversation with you while I was the chief of human capital, because I could have like moved things really quickly because I had the structural power to do it. I just didn't know, this wasn't the perspective that I was informed by. So people often go to the CEO because that's like who they think has the most structural power. But you'd be surprised that like you advocating, like using the processes that like exist inside actually can be a huge lever. And in Baltimore, we investigate every claim. We have like an anonymous hotline. And people don't have a lot of faith in it on the outside, but as I will tell you as a chief of human capital, the only way that we ever caught fraud in any way in the system ever was random people calling the hotline. Our audits didn't check it, but the only way we knew principals were like stealing money was because like they would buy, like literally somebody like buy a, she bought somebody like a refrigerator and she bought somebody like a washer and dryer, and like the auditing didn't catch it, but like those people, she did something bad to those people one day and they called the hotline and we were like, got it, and it was that is literally like the only way we caught fraud. But the hotline is something that like anybody could have used, and we caught a lot of things because of that. And the last thing I'll say is that you'd be shocked at how few people ever email either. So like, every time a parent or an advocate or whoever emailed the district, it always rippled through the district. And like, we would never let you know because we didn't have the capacity to deal with emails all day long. But every single time, and I'll never forget when I opened school last year, and we lose about 10% of our teachers a year, so we hire about 600 people. It's a lot of hiring to happen every single year. And this one kindergarten class opened up with 40 students, which is a lot for 5-year-olds. And I didn't know. So like I have a staff member who's responsible for the school, there's a principal, nobody tells me, doesn't get back to me, I don't know anything about it. This parent emails and is like, my kid's in a class with 40 people, da-da-da. She emails to the superintendent. Sonia emails me like, DeRay, can you do anything? And then I like magically have this teacher coming off leave. I have no money for her though. And I'm like, Sonia, will you help cover the cost for a couple weeks? And she's like, yes. And the only reason we put a teacher in that, like the only reason we split that classroom up was because this random parent, like who didn't think she had any authority, like she just emailed the district and like we got it, you know? And like so few people think that that can even be a way that they can make a difference. Like they sort of go to the school board and sort of, they give testimony there, and sometimes they sort of scream at us, but like you'd be shocked that like there are a lot of people on the inside who already want to do, they want to say yes, they just don't know where the problem is, and if you helped us find the problem, we'd actually do it really quickly.
One thing I just want to add, I think and we talked about it earlier, the information gap exists in the public domain and between schools and districts. And I think if there was a platform, and that's what we're building, a platform that lets other school districts and schools see best practices when it comes to equity and inclusion and diversity, then that'll help with a lot of the issues. The other thing is that building a platform that is parent-friendly so that they don't have to be a statistician to understand what the data is telling them, and parent-friendly, easy to understand language on school district scorecards, school-based scorecards, so that they can start advocating and using that data.
This is fantastic. I think what we do, I've been told we have 15 minutes. That's wonderful. I think we should use that 15 minutes for you guys to start raising some additional questions and expand the conversation. So do we have enough people out there that are ready to start? I can talk more, but I think we have microphones. So here's a question over here we can start with.
All right, my name is Colleen Fitzharris. I'm a federal public defender. So unfortunately, I get my clients come to me very far down the road to mass incarceration because they often have been in and out of the criminal justice system at a very early age. The vast majority of my clients are products of Detroit Public Schools. Very few graduate. We spend a lot of time trying to track down our clients' school records and have a very difficult time. And it's never a problem in the suburbs where all the white kids live. It is a problem in Detroit Public Schools, and I don't know if it's the same in Baltimore, but it feels like these students, the records, their very existence in the school system is gone. It's like they are erased. And so we are missing a critical piece of why they are where they are and who they are, because we don't have access to that. So, I think it's, when you're talking about access to, and how elusive general practices are in schools, I think it's a greater problem where just information about students is also elusive. And I don't know if there are technology advances or ways to improve that. But as someone who wants to advocate for people who they're almost like ghosts.
I'll just say at the system level, you'd be shocked. As a TV human capital, just a year ago, there was no data set that could tell me like every course that a kid was taking. And we were trying to lay people off, and I needed course level data, and it was like, we're like in the middle of the night recreating. It was pretty fantastic, like fantastical in 2017 to be like, there's no spreadsheet anywhere that like has the course data, like, and like teachers' names attached to it in a way that like, we don't have to come in for 12 hours on a Saturday and a Sunday for 4 weeks to try and paste together, right? So like we are just as frustrated on the inside as you. And the interesting thing about records rooms is that that's where we actually put like people that we can't, that I can't like fire immediately, we just put them in the record, like we're like, go to the records room. And we did it, a lot of people were like, records room. And the challenge with the records room is that like, normally it's not, nobody wants to run the records room, right? So the people running the records room are like not your brightest people in the world. So we really, like literally just a year ago, we moved it under the Office of Achievement and like the data office. So like now there are records and we know where the records are, but like we had to put really smart people running something that like isn't necessarily hard to organize, but like we had neglected it for so long. The second thing is that most of the people who service districts around this stuff just price us out. So like we couldn't, so we knew the solution, like we knew the cost of a robust document management solution, but I would literally have to end healthcare programming to afford it, right? And we were like, well, people probably should have healthcare, and like we'll just figure out the document thing, right? And we were making those sort of choices. And so if you ask me, like, how do we move teachers through the district? Like, literally, I'd have to hire somebody to walk through these pink sheets of paper because we couldn't digitize it because the cost of digitizing it was so much money that I'd have to fire 3 people. And like so we were making those sort of choices in 2017. And like, that was really hard, not just for advocates who wanted the data, but for us. Like, we were hampered by the decisions that we can make and roll up. And we were literally, we would tally, and that was sort of, I didn't think that it would still be that bad this late.
So, right, so we know that there's an information gap that exists when it comes to education sector data. And one of the things that we're working on is this idea of democratizing education data and having parents be in control of their data, of their child's data and of the family's data, and then being able to, and this is through surveys that they take, racial climate surveys and other types of information that the families can share with us or that can be gathered from the schools, and then having the parents own that data. And then when researchers or schools or districts want access to that data, they have to go to the parents to get that. There's a number of ways that we've been, it's still early stage looking into doing that using blockchain and various ledgers and creating the infrastructure for that. But I mean, this is an area where there's a massive room for improvement, and we're thinking about those types of things.
I think that is exciting. I will say I work with kids who are committed and who go to jails and prisons, and they'll call them youth rehabilitation centers, but they go to jails and prisons. So we've been fighting very hard. Just when a kid comes out, to get back into school is impossible, and it takes a very long time, and there's one woman who's in charge of it, and she doesn't do a good job, and she drives me crazy. So I've been fighting very hard to get our kids to be able to have those records. I just want you, and I will buy them, to give them a USB drive with their transcripts when they walk out the door, so that when they go to North Avenue, which is the place where kids enroll in school, they can just say, here's my transcript, as opposed to making 17 phone calls and like just very simple systems. But a part of the reason those systems don't exist is because we, as in the United States, have failed to fund and fully support public education, especially in districts, in Title I districts and districts where the majority of kids are kids of color. So Baltimore is doing everything on pink slips and paper. Literally, like until a year ago with this new student management system, everything was on paper in triplicate. So I would have law clerks who would be like, what is this black paper, like carbon paper? And I would be like, well, kids, let me teach you about the olden days that are alive and well. And that's simply because they won't put upfront capital to invest in technology that would be cost savings on the end. Everything is so short-sighted in how we fund and take care of kids of color, and that is an intentional effort at segregation. It keeps kids in separate and unequal schools. It is not unintentional. It is not accidental. It is purposeful, and we just have to change how we do education funding on the state level. We have to change education funding so that it's not district by district based on a community's wealth.
Hi, my name is Safa. I'm a student at Berkeley Law. Thank you so much for such a great panel today. I'm interested in the relationship between schools and the communities that they are a part of, and was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about how the conversation around trauma is being discussed or not being discussed. I know that, for example, there was I think, rather creative but potentially problematic lawsuit out of Compton to have trauma listed as a disability under the ADA. If you guys could talk a little bit more about how we can do a better job of talking about what our students are experiencing once they leave the schools, and how that might be impacting their ability to succeed.
So I'll talk about it a little bit. So trauma is the most undiagnosed thing that my kids experience, right? So there's a trauma screen at the beginning, and all of my trauma screens say no noticeable trauma, and then later in their family history, it'll be like, dad has been incarcerated, saw friend shot, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But for some reason, it never makes it into the trauma. So all of my kids are diagnosed, all of my clients are diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD, and none of them are diagnosed with trauma, even though, like in Baltimore 2 years ago, one school lost 6 kids. All of my kids, if they had been in a more suburban place where a tragedy had taken place, they would all have diagnoses of trauma. They would all have therapists who would be addressing their underlying pain and not their outward manifestations of trauma. So my experience of how trauma is viewed in the system or in schools is that unless you address the underlying white supremacy that views children of color as property to be made compliant, unless you address that, then trauma is just another thing to co-opt and to use to gain resources for wealthy white children. So it is like everything else. It's true, trauma is and the manifestations of trauma. It's not just kids experience trauma, but if a kid is being a little dick to you in school, it might not just be that child is evil, right? It might actually be that he experienced something and those are manifestations. So I don't think there's enough in understanding of what the manifestations of trauma look like, but 2, it tends to be something that people have co-opted and say, so they say trauma-informed, trauma-informed, trauma-informed. There are specific things, right? Trauma-informed care actually has standards and practices, and don't let anyone invoke it unless they are following guidelines for what trauma-specific care as opposed to trauma-informed, because it's just the newest thing to be co-opted and turned into a talking point. Much like restorative practice and restorative justice. It's very difficult to talk about restorative justice isn't a process, right? It's not a form you can fill out. It's a culture change, and caring about and investing in trauma is the same thing.
Yeah, let me just, just a quick follow-up to that, take my moderator's prerogative. This is so important. Categories of disability is a very significant factor that contributes to sorting kids in our K through 12 schools in ways that impact achievement. One way we see this, I think the trauma case is a good case. There's another case that has to do with the fact that black and brown and poor kids are disproportionately labeled as learning disabled. And these kinds of assignments don't carry with them additional resources, but they carry more punitive consequences. They effectively have these kids being treated as if they're under some disciplinary regime. And we see this is particularly egregious in places like Ann Arbor. I used to teach at Northwestern, Evanston, Illinois, where you have well-to-do, educated, often liberal communities, where you have public schools, but you have privilege being reproduced in sorting practices that have to do with disability assignments, school discipline practices, and tracking. So this is just like a footnote on the point that Jenny just made, and I think is useful for us to think about.
Trauma-informed classrooms, I think they're important. They're important for a number of reasons, because we know that stereotypes exist in schools, and we know that students who are experiencing high levels of trauma are more susceptible to engaging in those stereotypes and taking up those stereotypes. which will in turn cause them to act in various ways. So, moving the classroom environment, which it starts at a much higher level, from deficit-based thinking to more strength-based thinking, can do a lot to create a culture or an environment where you're not so focused on the things that the student does wrong, but let's look at the things that the student does right, and then that'll alleviate some of that stereotype threat, and then change can happen from there.
Well, I just got, okay, DeRay, you want to have the last word? I just was told that time is about out, so.
I'll just say quickly, so we agree, inside, we agree with everybody. We're like, yes, trauma-informed care, we're in a city in Baltimore, they're like, a lot of trauma, we need to do something. And then people were upset with us, right? They were sort of pushing us around, like, why are there so many consultants, right? Like, why are we bringing in a lot of consultants and da-da-da? Like, that would be the push that we got. And the only honest answer there was that, like, first of all, it's actually like we aren't getting a lot of quality guidance counselor applicants. Like, we just weren't getting them over time, and we just laid off guidance counselors. So that was sort of just a structural thing, and part of that is a funding problem. But the other thing was that because of the union, and I'm anti-police union, I'm not I'm pro-teachers unions, but one of the things that was hard to navigate was that if we made new positions that weren't like, we already had social workers in schools, but if we made real positions and put them in schools, we didn't know for a fact we'd have money in 2 years, but they'd be union jobs, so we wouldn't be able to let them go, right? So, Baltimore faced this issue sort of 5 years ago, where we hired all these people under Race to the Top in union positions. Race to the Top left, and then we have like 300 people that we have no money. So we're cutting positions left and right because we can't fire them because we'll get grieved. But like there literally is no money, right? So we've been trying to figure out like how do we use philanthropic dollars to like bring the services that we know are quality, but do it in a way that like we just don't know if the money's still going to be there, which is like a reality. The last thing I'll say is that some of it is about sort of commitment and ideology and stuff like that, but a lot of it too is about skill set. And like when we think about like why there's no data and stuff like that, like literally sometimes people just like don't know how to plan. Like it's like, so when I first got hired, I got hired to fix the first pay. Like the year before, it was like 500 people didn't get paid. People were at the building till midnight, da-da-da. And literally I bring everybody to the room and I say to them, like, how do we deliver the checks? And they're like, we send 5 vans out. We have 200 schools in the morning to visit all the schools. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, when the van gets to the school, what happens? They're like, well, the driver calls the secretary and the secretary comes out and picks the checks up. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, what happens if the secretary doesn't come out? They're like, we go to the next school. I'm like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. And then I'm like, well, when do the vans get back to the district? And they're like 4:00. I'm like, half our schools are closing. But like that is like, how do teachers even know they got? So literally, I'm like, we should put 2 people in the vans and somebody will deliver the checks to the school. They're like, you're a genius. And I'm like, I'm not a genius. Sorry, that like wasn't, but literally, like we cut down from having like being there till midnight. We get like 60 people that come visit. 40 of them are because there was like a glitch in the payroll office, not because anything structurally, and we left at 5:00, right? But it was literally just like mapping out like how are we delivering the checks, right? That didn't take like rocket science, but it was like a skill gap. And what I'd say to people, like a lot of people who care about education don't want to work in districts, like they don't want to do that work. And like we will need you to come in. And as my last pitch for the lawyer people, which is most of you, is like the workers' comp space is not very sexy, but a huge site of like we need innovative thinking. And when I think about the problem that I had with the police officers, it was workers' comp fraud, because the law like treats police very differently than it treats everybody else. And like we just couldn't navigate it. So if we have 80 officers, I would have 20 out on some workers' comp thing that I couldn't do anything about. 10 who we had taken their guns away. So like it wasn't really a lot of police officers in play in the end anyway, because of structural things that I couldn't, and as a chief of human capital, I could like put surveillance on you. Like I could do a whole lot of things, but the system was so like bent towards whatever, like if they said they had hypertension, I'm like, they're just out for 4 months, it's like, I can't do anything about it. And like, that was actually like a harder thing that we didn't have good thinking on.
Well, let's thank our panelists for such an engaging discussion.